Kathy from houseoftoefl.com, and I'm here today to talk to you about some of the new questions 1 and 2 on the TOEFL speaking test. As you may have noticed, or as you may have heard, the ETS has changed question 1 and 2 significantly. Unfortunately, many materials and books do not discuss or give examples of these changes. So today's video will show you what some of those changes are and give you some ways that you can answer. So we'll be going through some sample answers as well. But first, a quick review is probably necessary. So first of all, as you probably know, you have 15 seconds to prepare for this question. That's not a lot of time, and we will discuss what you should do with those 15 seconds later in this video. In addition, you have 45 seconds to speak. There are 6 tasks. As I mentioned, today we're going to talk about 1 and 2. They are all scored from 0 to 4. Then those scores are averaged to a total of 30. Now, 30 is the best possible score you can get on the speaking section. 30 means that you got 4 on all 6 tasks. And how does the ETS score these questions? Well, there are 3 things they're looking for. The first is your delivery. A high score here would mean that your speech is clear, your pronunciation is clear, and so is your intonation. You may have an accent, everyone who takes the TOEFL does, but the grader must be able to understand everything you say during your 45 seconds. Second, you will be scored on language use. This means that you have a good command of grammar, that your grammar is correct and that it's flexible. Flexible means that you can easily transition from the past to the future and so on, and use complex grammar if necessary. Now, here we have vocab. Of course, that means vocabulary. You must show that you have a very good vocabulary in the speaking section. So I always say the number one thing you can do to improve your TOEFL score is to improve your vocabulary. Try not to repeat your vocabulary words during your speaking. That could lower your score. And last, they grade you on topic development. This means it's well developed, which basically means you give a lot of examples to support your argument. And cohesive. That means you use transition words to show how your answer comes together. So you use words like however, moreover, for example, to illustrate this, on the other hand, and that you use those transitions appropriately and they make your answer sound very cohesive. So one of the questions that's becoming much more popular on the TOEFL is the 3-option prompt. Now, a lot of my students are telling me that they're getting these on their exam, so you should be prepared for it. Now, it looks a little bit like a question 2, but you have to choose one option out of 3 possible options that they give you. So let's look at a couple of examples, although of course there are hundreds of possible examples they could give you on the actual test. But let's just look at 2 for now. Okay, the first one says, which volunteer job would you prefer? Read to children at a library, work in an animal shelter, or cook food for the homeless, and why? The second question asks, your city government wants to improve your community. Do you think the government should add a public park, build a public pool, or build a public library, and why? So let's talk about how to answer this question. The first thing you need to do, of course, is decide which one you're going to support and think of 2 reasons why you are supporting that choice. So let's say, for example, number 1, I decide I'm going to choose read to children at a library. During my 15 seconds, I need to think of my 2 reasons why I would do that. So I'm going to say, if I were going to volunteer, I would prefer to read to children at a library for 2 reasons. First of all, I really enjoy the company of children. I have a niece and a nephew who come over every weekend and we play together, and I really enjoy being with them. They bring a lot of joy, energy, and excitement to my life. So I know I like being around children, and I think this would be a really good job for me. In addition, I absolutely love to read children's books. I remember when I was growing up, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was my favorite all-time book. I would love to share this book with children because it's such an amazing adventure story. Now, of course, I didn't time that. It might have been a little bit short, but I want to point something out here. I used a lot of details. I didn't just say I like children and then move on to the next reason. I mentioned that I have a niece and a nephew and that they come over every weekend. I didn't just say I like to read, I gave the name of a book. These types of details are how you get a much higher score. So please make sure you give a lot of supporting details. Now let's take a look at the second one. I have to change my language a bit here because it's a totally different question. The grammar is different. Do you think the government should? So when I respond, I'm going to say, in my view, I think the government should build a public library for several reasons. So you have to be prepared to change your language depending on the prompt. Now, the next TOEFL prompt I want to present to you is the give advice to a friend prompt. In this prompt, you're asked to give your friend some advice. Now, let's look at 3 examples, although of course there are thousands that could come up on the test. Your friend is traveling to a new country for university. What advice would you give your friend and why? Your friend wants to lose weight. What advice would you give your friend and why? Your friend needs to improve his grades. What advice would you give your friend and why? Now, many of my students aren't sure which gender pronouns they should use. So they don't know, in other words, if they should say he and him or she and her. In actuality, it doesn't matter and it won't affect your score as long as you're consistent. So for instance, if you start with the male pronoun he, continue with he and then also use him. Now, I want to point out something else out here. There are 2 grammar forms here that are possible. One is the continuous and one is the simple present. And that is going to affect how you respond. If it is continuous like this, is traveling, you're going to say in your response, if my friend were traveling to a new country, I would give him a few pieces of advice. So, we're traveling and then I would. That's how we give the hypothetical answer because after all, this is a hypothetical scenario. And for the next grammar form, it's given to you in the simple present, but you have to change the main verb to the simple past. If my friend wanted to lose weight, I would give my friend a few pieces of advice. The second thing I want to point out here is also very important. Advice is a non-count noun, which means you have to say a few pieces of advice, or you can say some advice. But do not say advices. It's not a word, it's not correct. Advice cannot be plural. So let me give you one sample answer, and I will do it for the first prompt. If my friend were traveling to a new country for university, I would give him a few pieces of advice. First, I would tell him to study the language before he goes, so that he can communicate with the local people there. For instance, if he's going to Spain, I would tell him to learn some Spanish. Because once I went to Spain without any Spanish knowledge, and it was very easy for me to get lost, and it was very confusing. None of the locals could speak to me in English, and I couldn't get directions to my hotel. It was very frustrating. So I would tell him to learn some of the language before he goes. The second thing I would tell him to do is to save some money before he goes. And this is because it can be very difficult to find work in a new country. For instance, I have a friend who recently moved here from Greece and hasn't found a job yet, and she's really struggling because she didn't save any money. That's why I would tell my friend to save money before he travels. A new question type that is coming up more and more on the TOEFL is the advantages and disadvantages prompt. This prompt asks you to name the advantages and disadvantages of something. Here are some examples. Your city government plans to open an elementary school on your street. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this plan? What are the advantages and disadvantages of having a strong leader in your group? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the use of smartphones? Now, of course, you don't have time to mention all the advantages and all the disadvantages of these options. However, what you should do is choose one major advantage and one major disadvantage, and then bridge them with a transition like however, or on the other hand, there's also an advantage. Now, to start your speaking, you should say, there are both advantages and disadvantages too, and then talk about the key words from the prompt. For example, there are both advantages and disadvantages to opening an elementary school on my street. There are both advantages and disadvantages to having a strong leader in my group. There are both advantages and disadvantages to the use of smartphones. Now, let me give you a sample response putting all of this information together. This sample response would receive, of course, a high score on the TOEFL. There are both advantages and disadvantages to the use of smartphones. The advantage is there's a lot of information in smartphones that you can look up immediately. For example, I'm not very good with directions and I easily get lost. However, my smartphone contains a GPS system. That way I can just type in where I want to go and my smartphone will tell me exactly how to get there and I never get lost. On the other hand, there are disadvantages to smartphones. One is that we are no longer communicating clearly with each other in person. For instance, yesterday I walked into a restaurant with my husband. We sat down at a table and looked around. We noticed that most of the people in the restaurant weren't talking to each other. Instead, they were texting on their cell phones or surfing social media outlets. So they weren't really communicating with each other or having a conversation. So that response would receive a high score. The next question type will not be very surprising because it is mentioned in some of the older materials. However, it is worth reviewing here very quickly. This is where you're asked to describe something. So let's look at 3 examples. Describe an annual day in your country when you give people special gifts. Describe a fear you have overcome. How did you overcome it? Describe an experience when you faced a conflict. How did you resolve it? Now I want to point something out here. The second and third questions have a second part. How did you overcome it? How did you resolve it? That means in order to get the highest score, you must answer that part of the question as well. So let's do a sample for the second question that would receive a high score. One fear I have overcome is my fear of flying in airplanes. When I was growing up, I was terrified of flying. Every time I got on the airplane, I felt like I couldn't breathe and I felt like my heart was racing. And I overcame this in a few ways. First of all, my doctor told me to take deep breaths through my nose and out through my mouth, and to do that 3 times very deeply. After I did that, I found it easier to relax on the airplane. In addition, I overcame it by taking a lot of flights all over the country. For instance, this year I went from LA to New York, and I also went to Miami on vacation, and I flew on both of these trips. By flying and exposing myself to the thing I was most afraid of, I was able to realize it was not actually a dangerous thing to do, and this helped me to overcome my fear. So that example would receive a high score. Notice again how many details I had in that sample. Again, details are the key to getting a very good score on questions 1 and 2. Now we're moving on to question 2. For today's lesson, we're only going to discuss what has changed on question 2. So what they have done that is different than before is they're starting to use agree or disagree with a statement prompts. You will recognize these immediately because they used to be used only for the independent writing, but now they're actually being used for question 2 of the speaking. So you should be prepared that this could come on your test. I have 2 examples here on the board. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Video games offer benefits to children. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Coworkers make the best friends. Now, how do you approach this question? Of course, the first thing you must decide is whether you're going to agree or disagree. Then in your 15 seconds, you need to think of the 2 major reasons why you're going to either agree or disagree. Then, of course, when you speak, you're going to have to fill in the details. The first thing you should say is, personally, I agree with the statement that, and repeat the statement. Or, of course, personally, I disagree with the statement, and then repeat the statement. Then next you say for 2 reasons. Give your first reason, give the details, give your second reason, and give the details. Let me give you an example. Personally, I agree with the statement that coworkers make the best friends for a few reasons. First of all, you have more in common with your coworkers. For instance, you have the same boss and the same customers. So there's usually more to talk about and more to gossip about, and it's much more interesting to have a conversation with them. In addition, you spend more time with your coworkers than you do with other people. For example, at my last job, I worked at a school, and every lunch break, I had lunch with the same 6 teachers. We also shared the same breaks. So we got to know each other really well because the time we had to get together gave us a foundation of a strong friendship, which we have to this day. That's why I agree that coworkers make the best friends. Now, let's go over some of the most frequently asked questions that I get during my private sessions, private tutoring with students. One very common question is, what do I do during my preparation time? Now, as you know, you only get 15 seconds to prepare. It's not very much time. So what you want to do is think of what the answer is going to be, the main answer in your head, but don't write that down. What you want to write down on your paper is your 2 supporting reasons. You can remember, after all, what your main idea is going to be, but it's very easy to forget your 2 supporting reasons while you're talking, especially since you're going to be quite nervous during the exam. Now, you do not have time to write down all the supporting details. And honestly, you don't even have time to think of them. You're going to have to get used to, through a lot of practice, thinking of these supporting examples while you're speaking. The second question I get is, what if I'm still talking when the beep sounds? Well, that doesn't really matter. The ETS grades hundreds of these every day, and they're quite used to students who are still speaking when the beep goes off. What you need to be concerned about is what you have already said before the beep. As long as you've given a full and complete answer, you can still receive a very high score. Next, how quickly should I speak? Some students think that the ETS counts their words, and therefore they should speak very quickly. Actually, that's not true. These are scored holistically. Your words are not counted by the ETS. Therefore, you should speak at a natural pace. Do not speak too quickly, and do not speak too slowly. Next, do I need 2 supporting reasons? The answer to that depends on you. I strongly recommend having 2 supporting reasons, although some students are very good at giving 1 reason and really developing it. Just keep in mind, if you're only going to give 1 reason, you have to have a lot of supporting details. That's why I recommend giving 2 reasons. It divides the time up very well, because you can have 20 seconds on your first reason, 20 seconds on your second reason, and you still have a few seconds left for the conclusion. On the other hand, if you only have 1 reason, you might run out of things to say at 35 or 36 seconds. Then you might panic and try to add a second supporting reason, but not have enough time to develop it. I've seen that hundreds of times. That's why I always advise my students to give 2 supporting reasons. Through practice, you'll figure out which is better for you. And finally, how do I think of ideas? Okay, the answer to this is simple, but it takes a lot of work. You have to practice, practice, practice. You need to jump online and buy books and see what the sample questions are, and just practice every day with a timer. That way, when you get into the TOEFL, you will have practice speaking about hundreds of different subjects, and nothing they give you will surprise you. You will be ready to answer any question. And also, of course, have a large vocabulary, because the larger your vocabulary, the more adept you will be at answering any kind of question they might think of to give you. And again, this is Kathy from House of TOEFL, and you can go to my website, www.houseoftofl, for more information. And as always, good luck on your TOEFL.